Hello friends, you've stumbled across a short clip from the Daily Switch 2 podcast, which, believe it or not, is a podcast that is about the Switch 2 with new episodes released daily. What will they think of next? So, Kirby. He's perhaps the most well-known Nintendo character not created by Nintendo, though Nintendo always publishes the games, and there have only ever been Kirby games for Nintendo platforms, of course. He was created by Masahiro Sakurai, the legend, who was working for HAL Laboratory at the time. His simple design is because he was originally just a placeholder graphic while they were designing a platform game, but soon Sakurai became fond of the little fella, originally naming him Popopo before Nintendo of America suggested a name that would appeal to a more Western audience, giving a list of names to choose from. Presumably, Kirby was suggested as a pun because of his circular shape. He is rather curvy after all. But Miyamoto liked the name Kirby for a different reason. When Universal had tried to sue Nintendo for Donkey Kong being inspired by King Kong, the American lawyer who got them off the hook won Mr. John Kirby. Miyamoto seemed to have a habit of picking names from random Nintendo of America adjacent people when trying to pick a name to appeal to Westerners, with Jumpman being eventually named after the landlord of their warehouse at the time, surname Seagal, first name Mario. While not named after anyone in general, Link is also a westernized word. The character was originally meant to be a generic, mute, faceless, genderless character so that the player could easily imagine that they represented them in the game world, the link between the player and Hyrule. High and rule also being an anglicism, of course. The sadly missed Satoru Iwata, press F to pay respects, once said that Kirby was given a simple circular design so that anyone would be able to draw him. And that is exactly how Kirby first grabbed my attention. Anyone who knows Kirby's Adventure on the NES will know that the introduction and attract screen demo sequence literally shows kids how to draw Kirby by starting with a circle and adding details. This attract screen was the very first time that I ever saw the little pink dude, and right away I loved him. I remember it clearly because I grew up in the UK, where in the 1980s the NES had not been the big success that it had been in the States or Japan, and it was actually very rare for me to ever see one in the wild, certainly in the 80s. Almost everyone either owned a microcomputer, the 8-bit Sinclair Spectrums, Amstrad CPCs or Commodore 64, a 16-bit Amiga, or if you were lucky enough to own a console, it was likely a Sega Master System, or if you were really rich, a Mega Drive. The Super Nintendo eventually catching on, but not until late in 93-94. But in early 93, I was on a school trip to France, and the first stop-off was in a large hypermarket, so our teachers could fill up the bottom deck of our double-decker bus with duty-free beer and wine. Yes, the 90s was somewhat of a different time. But as you will have heard if you listened to the Daily Switch 2 Bastille Day French episode, which, by the way, I sadly had to take down because of a copyright claim issue, but I will be re-editing and uploading again very soon once all this Gamescom nonsense is over. Nintendo was far more successful in France than in the UK, partially because of the unique mix of a heavily manga and anime-focused culture and a unique TV system, CCAM, which meant that consoles had to be specifically modded for French televisions, but Bandai were already established in the country and helped to import and push Nintendos, to such an extent that when they eventually decided to set up their own specific divisions in different European countries, France was one of the very first and biggest unique markets for Nintendo. And so, inside this hypermarket, there were many large Nintendo stands with tons of posters, standees, and CRT TVs with demonstration units so you could try out the games. And the one that caught my eye was Kirby. If you know the NES market, you will know that Kirby's Adventure is one of the most technically advanced NES games available from the time, thanks largely to the multiple upgrades within the cartridge itself, including the MMC3 mapper, a battery backup, and the largest ROM size available at the time. It's also a game that came out 8 years after the console's launch, so the developers had really had a chance to work out how to get the absolute most from that system. This wasn't lost on me at the time because I remember being distinctly impressed with Kirby's Adventure. My limited experience of the NES had mostly been with black box style simple games, and I'd always been firmly convinced that the Master System was vastly more powerful. But Kirby seriously impressed me, and I made a mental note that now I wanted to pick up an NES at some point, specifically to play this game. What I didn't know at the time was Kirby's Adventure was the second game in the series. But when I got a Game Boy for my birthday later on that year and bought a magazine for the system, I was very happy to learn that there was a Kirby game available for it, Kirby's Dreamland. At the time, only knowing what little I had seen in that demo kiosk in France and remembering it hazily, Kirby's Dreamland seemed like the same game as Kirby's Adventure, just on the handheld. I didn't know what surprises many Kirby fans when they go back and play the first game for the first time. Kirby didn't actually get his iconic copy abilities until the second game. This didn't bother me because I didn't know what I was missing. The only thing that confused me was why Kirby was white and not pink on the box art. Apparently, many people at Nintendo were surprised when Kirby's Adventure came out. They had no idea he had always intended to be pink. Miyamoto, for example, thought he was meant to be yellow. The dangers of releasing your first game on a monochrome system, I guess. We should count ourselves lucky that he didn't end up being pea soup green. So yeah, for those of you that don't know, Kirby's copy abilities are pretty key to his character from the second game onwards. He already had a pretty unique mechanic of being able to suck up the air around him in order to float like a balloon and then puff out a blast of air as an attack. And if next to an enemy, he could suck them up and then spit them out like a heavier projectile. Pretty neat mechanic and lots of fun to use. But Kirby's Adventure went one step further. Certain enemies can be swallowed and then he will gain their special powers, gaining all kinds of abilities for attacking and traversal, sometimes even opening up new areas to explore. Kirby's Adventure went on to be one of the most iconic and successful NES games, and this spawned a sequel, Dreamland 2, on the Game Boy, and spin-offs started to appear too. Kirby's Pinball Land and Bat and Ball variant Block Ball are two of the best and most polished Game Boy games in my opinion, and the Super Nintendo got a neat isometric mini-golf game called Dream Course, and while Sega were busy rebranding Puyo Puyo as Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine for the West, Nintendo did exactly the same but called it Kirby's Avalanche. Star Stacker was a neat puzzle game for both Game Boy and Super Nintendo, and by the time Dreamland 3 was being made, it was squarely for the 16-bit system, following after the equally excellent Kirby Superstar, known as Kirby's Fun Pack in some regions, because it split its levels into 8 separate smaller games on one cartridge, Sakurai stating at the time that the idea was to try and provide unique, short, fun experiences, as he felt many games were becoming too long and repetitive. There's not enough time to cover everything here. Kirby has appeared in over 50 games, 39 of them of his own, or maybe 40 now I suppose, and the rest being crossover titles like Smash Brothers, of course expertly helmed by Kirby's own creator. In fact, there has been at least one Kirby game every single year since that first Dreamland title in 1992. These games have continued the tradition of Kirby, splitting his time pretty evenly between mainline platform adventures, of which there have been 16 or 17 if you now include Star-Crossed Worlds, and a wide variety of spin-offs covering almost every conceivable gaming genre. Notable titles for me include Tilt and Tumble, a year 2000 puzzle game which included an accelerometer in the cartridge, so you could roll Kirby around like a ball with motion controls on the Game Boy Color. Incredible. 2010's Epic Yarn, a unique-looking 2D platform game for the Wii from Goodfeel, where all the graphics are made out of string and presumably served as an inspiration for the team's latter work on Yoshi's Woolly World, which is my favourite game still left stranded on the Wii U, though a Switch 2 port is heavily rumoured due to what appeared to be an accidental leak from Nintendo. Both Epic Yarn and Woolly World did get 3DS ports with downgraded graphics but extra features. If we get remastered Switch 2 versions of them both, I will be a very, very happy man. Planet Robobot in 2016 is probably my favourite of the modern 2.5D platform titles, where Kirby dons mech suits. This is flat out one of the best 3DS exclusive games and is crying out for a modern remaster. One of the most unique and popular Kirby games is the spin-off title Kirby Air Ride, a racing game for the GameCube that released in 2003. But unlike what you would expect, it's not simply a Mario Kart clone with Kirby characters. It employs a really unique control scheme and insane emphasis on speed by mastering these techniques. Uniquely, all tied to the skillful use of just a single button, a feature Sakurai was very proud of. Your vehicles are hoverboard-esque machines and control a little like the vehicles in Wipeout or F-Zero, but also can get large air and perform tricks in them like a snowboarding game, and can glide whilst in the air. As well as the expected racing modes, City Trial mode became the cult favourite with a sort of open area battle royale GTA style, where you can grab different machines, find upgrades for them, and then race or battle with other players. Of course, after more than 20 years, Nintendo has finally announced a sequel to this cult classic, for the Switch 2 nonetheless, an exclusive, Kirby's Air Riders. And Sakurai did a whole 45-minute direct breaking down the game. It looks amazing, and I've already made a full episode previewing it, but because of all the episodes I had to put out because of Gamescom, it will actually go live after this one, because I wanted to release this review as close to the release date as possible. While Sakurai is the creator of Kirby, it's worth noting that he doesn't work on all of the games. In fact, Air Riders will be his first Kirby game that he's worked on since Amazing Mirror in 2004, after which his work with Nintendo has been through his own company, Sora, and Bandai Namco, rather than HAL Laboratory, working mostly on the various Smash Bros. Games, and of course that excellent Kid Icarus game as well. Another game that's crying out for a Switch 2 version, please Nintendo. Now, I was one of the lucky people that got a Nintendo 64 on the launch day, and the reason that I did was clear: Super Mario 64. The first time I saw a preview of that game in 1995 at the Shoshinkai show, my jaw was on the floor and I couldn't believe how cool it was to finally see Mario in proper 3D. I loved that game. I basically lived in it for 6 months, and to this day I replay it at least once every year. But at the time, whilst I liked Mario a lot, I was actually arguably a bigger fan of Kirby from a character design standpoint. I was so hyped when I heard that a Kirby 64 was in development. But it was delayed over and over, and then when it finally released in the year 2000, I was slightly disappointed when it turned out to be a 2.5D game. Basically a 2D platformer with low-poly 3D graphics, a bit like also what happened with Yoshi 64, which turned out to be Yoshi's Story. It was a fun game, but not what I'd imagined. Since then, I have yearned for a proper 3D platformer starring Kirby. And with every new Nintendo console, both handheld and home, I hoped that one would come, but it never did, until 22 years later, when I finally got my wish: Kirby and the Forgotten Land on the Switch. Well, that was funny / sad / informative / stupid, wasn't it? Feel free to mentally redact to make that make sense with the clip that you just heard. I don't know what it was. I'm just recording a bumper. But if you enjoyed the clip, please give it a like. If you'd like to hear more, click subscribe, and you can find all the ways to listen to and support the full daily podcast at linktree/dailyswitch2. That's linktr.ee/dailyswitch2. Let's go! Did I sound like I mean that? I do. I really do.